Hello and a warm welcome to this brand new Sustainability Education podcast. I'm Dr. Stefan T. Siegel, postdoc researcher at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. In sustainability education, ideas and assumptions exist that sound plausible, but that are at least questionable or even dangerous at a closer look. In this podcast, I want to discuss myths and facts about sustainability education and the things in between. For this purpose, I invite world-leading experts on environmental and sustainability education, educational psychology, and myth and misinformation research. This podcast series is part of the research project Identifying, Understanding, and Challenging Myths in and about Sustainability Education. My vision is a more evidence-informed, effective, and ethically responsible sustainability education, and I hope to push the boundaries of knowledge in this field. I would be most delighted if you listened in and joined our conversation. You can do so on all the usual podcast platforms. Enjoy listening.
Melanie Trecek-King is an associate professor of biology at Massasoit Community College. There she teaches a general education science course designed to foster critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy skills in students. She has a Bachelor of Science in Biology and Chemistry and a Master of Arts in Ecology from the University of Nebraska in Omaha. Currently, she is also the Education Director for the Mental Immunity Project and part of the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative. These initiatives aim to advance and apply the science of cognitive immunology to foster mental immunity against misinformation. In the past years, she has also created a really wonderful website on critical thinking, which is called Thinking is Power, where she shares regularly insights and educational materials such as infographics, videos, or lesson plans. As the field of cognitive immunology and the topic of mental immunity is very, very dear to my heart, or maybe rather my mind, I'm thrilled to speak with Melanie today about how to conquer misinformation, among other about sustainability education. Welcome, Melanie. Where are you joining us from today?
Oh, I am so honored to join you. I am outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
Are you calling from your home office?
I am actually. We travel full time, but this is one of the very rare moments where I'm at home, and you can see I'm surrounded by my husband's instruments.
Sounds really lovely, or looks really lovely. Thanks for being here. Let's get right to the first thematic area, understanding sustainability education and educational myths. On your website, Thinking is Power, you use different terms such as misinformation, myths, claims, beliefs, and for instance, also pseudoscience. Could you maybe clarify if and how you would differentiate between these terms?
Yeah, I love that we're starting by definitions because some of these terms have multiple meanings, and if we're not consistent with them, they can be confusing. So I'm going to start with belief. A belief is any idea that we accept as true. So it doesn't have to be true, but if we accept it as true, it is one of our beliefs. And there are different kinds of beliefs. It could be anything from like an opinion or an objective belief. But if it's something that I hold as true, then it is one of my beliefs. Philosophers distinguish between beliefs and knowledge by saying, so knowledge is a subset of beliefs. It is a type of belief in which it is also true, and we have good reasons for accepting it as true. So the knowledge is a justified true belief. In my communications, that word trips up a lot of people because they think science is not the realm of beliefs. And I understand where they're coming from. I was a holdout on that too. Science is a process of learning about the world in which we should have more justifications for our beliefs, but we know people who don't accept science. And I could accept science without understanding. So a belief is, I think it's true. Misinformation is information that is not true. It's misleading in some way. It is false. There are different kinds of misinformation. There's a lot of talk these days about disinformation. So disinformation is a subtype of misinformation that is deliberately deceptive. And another one in there that you had, pseudoscience. So I actually distinguish between science and what I call science's pretenders. Science is a way of knowing that follows overall processes in which a community of experts are collectively collecting and evaluating evidence. Pseudoscience and science denial pretend to be scientific. They put on the trappings of science, they dress up like science. Pseudoscience is, if we distinguish between pseudoscience and science denial, to me, they're like two sides of the same coin in that they're both looking like science, but pseudoscience is motivated by when we want to believe something. When we want to believe something, our standard of evidence is low. Science denial is motivated by not wanting to accept well-established science. And so we set our standard of evidence impossibly high. They often play on each other. Like when I don't want to accept science, I'll deny the science and then fill it in with a related pseudoscience. But they do have key differences. By the way, you're going to have to just shut me up because I love to talk about these things and I'll just keep going forever. So I hope that was helpful.
It's super interesting. Would you distinguish between misinformation and myths, or the relation? How do you see the relation between beliefs, false beliefs, myths, and misinformation? Are those interchangingly, or are there subtle differences in your opinion?
So I would define a myth as something that's widely believed but not true, and that seems to be what you focus on. So these are things that people generally accept, a type of false belief, but it's a widely believed one.
I see. You've worked a lot on critical thinking and how to deal with misinformation. Educational myths and sustainability education could currently be considered hot topics, although they are around for a very long time. What comes to mind when you hear the term myths in and about sustainability education?
So my background is ecology, but I've taught environmental science for a long time. And so the response here is going to come from what I've heard from my students over the years. People just generally don't understand what sustainability even is. Like even getting down to, they think sustainability is about saving the environment, right? And so environmental science is not entirely about sustainability education, but there's a strong overlap. And so when I try and teach my students these issues, they bring with them a set of false beliefs that I actually find in a classroom are relatively easy to address, but need to be addressed head on. So almost within the first week, when we talk about what is sustainability, sustainability is for the people, the planet, and our pocketbook, right? And so, well, just right away, we're not just talking about saving the trees. Actually, a plant ecologist on the prairie, we would cut down trees to save the prairie, right? So it is complicated, but yeah, even what sustainability is, I find a widespread misconception.
Do you see a connection between critical thinking, mental immunity, and the topic of myths in and about sustainability education? And if so, or which ones?
Yeah, my good friend and colleague, Andy Norman. Andy's the executive director of mental immunity. He wrote the book on mental immunity. I'm the education director. And we have wonderful conversations about critical thinking and mental immunity. So I'm a critical thinking educator. And one of my favorite things to do when I talk to teachers is, do you teach critical thinking in your class? Oh, yes, I do. Great. What is critical thinking? Oh.
So definitions again.
Yes. Yes, actually, and I have a new article out in Skeptical Inquirer about
Yeah, I saw that one.
Oh, okay. So that actually came from I have a good friend who is a longtime science educator in a middle school. She kept saying, "Melanie, we do teach critical thinking." Well, yeah, and then we would like talk past each other, and it took us like 2 years for us to realize that we were talking about different definitions of critical thinking, and that's so ironic because like step one is define your terms. So this is a roundabout way of saying most educators tend to define critical thinking as a type of problem solving, in that it's deeply thinking through a topic to come to a better understanding and potentially make a better decision. I define critical thinking more broadly in its a set of dispositions and skills. So being curious about what's true,
Mm-hmm.
being skeptical, not just of what I hear, but of my own beliefs, being humble, knowing the limits of what I know, being able to find reliable information. While critical thinking in the problem-solving definition is specific to a field. To be able to think critically about sustainability education, you have to know a lot about sustainability education. But the dispositions, the better thinking version of critical thinking that I've described is more of a foundation for all types of better thinking. It can be broadly applied to other definitions. Now back to Andy, because Andy has this concept of the mind has an immune system. And part of that came from his frustration with critical thinking. How do we define critical thinking? What does critical thinking mean to you? How do we teach it? How do we measure it? All of those, like if you can't even define it well, then how do you measure it? So his idea of mental immunity is essentially the better thinking definition of critical thinking, but in, I think, a really useful analogy. So if I go into a classroom and I say, okay, I want you to imagine that your mind has something like an immune system where outside of your mind, there is information and your mind is trying to figure out what is true. There is a series of filters in place and shortcuts that we use to decide what to accept, our beliefs. So, in the mental immunity framing of critical thinking, it's basically what I think is a really useful analogy to teach it, because when I go into a classroom and I present it that way, it's tangible to students, and they can, oh, well, that makes sense. So if I work on this filter, then I can better prevent false ideas from getting into my brain and let the good ideas in.
So to keep the mind bugs, the mind parasites, the bad ideas, the faulty ideas out.
Can I actually, since you study this for a living, is my definition in line with yours?
I think so, but we will dive a little bit into that later. So, but from what I've heard and what you've said, I think so too. So I also have a broader definition of critical thinking. It's not just problem solving for me. It's also like being able to do lateral searches, etc., and to have that curiosity. I'm also very intrigued whether critical thinking is a domain-specific competence, which I believe is the case. So you have to have domain-specific knowledge to be a effective critical thinker. It's something different if you're competent in physics, for instance, where you have the background, than in music, for instance. If we go a little bit further and explore myths further, you work on thinking as power, and for the Mental Immunity Project, you have come across pre-bunked and debunked questionable beliefs on various topics and in various domains. When you think of your decades of experience in teaching and research, have you also come across myths in and about environmental and sustainability education? You just mentioned one. Did you come across other myths as well?
So I've been teaching for a while now, probably 25 years. And early on in my career, I did not necessarily accept the science of GMOs, for example. I also, for a while, even in my teaching at college, I was using the carbon footprint calculators. And those still have value, I suppose, but I didn't realize that those had really been popularized by fossil fuel companies to try and deflect attention on them onto individual consumers. I don't know if those would be considered myths, as much as, well, I don't know. Are those myths?
I'm also intrigued or curious about that. I think in sustainability education, often, or in education in general, claims are not often falsifiable in a strict sense. And there is, of course, something between myth and fact, right? A gray area, or there are different shades of justification or something like that. So I'm not sure about that one, but I would agree that like the carbon footprint deflects or shifts the burden of responsibility to the individual. And like puts away focus from the structures and from the collective and the corporate world and so on. So if you say, for instance, I can't save the world, I'm just a single educator, a single citizen, I would rather say this is a misleading belief. I'm not sure if it's a myth, but it could be misleading because you have a certain responsibility, you have a certain circle of, how do you call it, control, or you can do something, but of course it's a false dilemma. You need both, like the individual actions and the collective change. But of course, the collective change, the systemic changes start with the individual actions. So that would be my take on that. But I'm more interested in your take. Do you think back to the beginning of your career, for instance? Did you hold or have you held misconceptions yourself about sustainability education? So how to teach it, how to learn it, that would be very interesting to know. And what did you help to overcome those misconceptions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm honestly not sure I held any myths. It was more a process of iterating and reiterating the curriculum to narrow down which concepts were most important to teach and the best way to teach them. So, for example, this would not be a myth, but over the years, I realized how important the tragedy of the commons was.
Oh, yeah.
And so I started to make it more of a focus and to do an activity, actually do it the first week of the semester where students pretend there's a online computer simulation where they are fishing companies. And I tell them, like, uh, your job here is to win this game by making the most money. And you're going to fish for 10 years. You need to buy ships and go fish and blah, blah, blah. And I mean, look, every single time by year 6 or 7, the whole class has collapsed the fishery. Um, but
Tragedy.
what a tragedy. But in the meantime, like, I incentivized them to win this game. I told them they could get extra credit points, and students will do anything for extra credit points, even if they're completely, like, useless. You get 5 extra credit points if you win this game. And so everybody goes out and, like, buys ships and goes to fish, and then they collapse the fishery. And then we get to talk about, okay, what happened? This was all about you trying to maximize your profit in the short term, and the common was the fishery, and everybody was doing that, and so the end result is that you all collapsed it. And then look what happens. None of you have any money. Actually, you all own the bank a bunch of money. Um, and so, again, it's not a myth, but it's realization that the foundation of a lot of environmental problems is the tragedy of the commons. And so it's a really important concept to teach. Let's front load the class with this and then talk about it the rest of the semester. Obviously, our science on some things has gotten better. And so details I've taught over the years have changed a bit. I'm not entirely sure I had any myths at the beginning.
So if I understood you correctly, like the short-term thinking versus the long-term thinking is a huge root cause for a lot of the environmental problems, that we focus too much on the short-term thinking. But you could then argue maybe we should educate only focused on long-term thinking. And that's where I would say again, this might be a questionable idea at least. So we need both, probably. We need this long-term perspective, but also the short-term perspective.
Well, that's interesting, because I would say, it's not just a short-term versus long-term thinking. It is what can happen in a completely unregulated space. So maybe this is the myth here. I know, a lot of denial of environmental problems stems from solution aversion. Like, we don't like the perceived consequences or the solutions to a problem, and so we deny the problem. Well, okay, here is what happens when there is no regulation. Okay, so is regulation inherently a bad thing, or does it actually mean that you get to have money and fish, not just now, but for a longer period of time? So there is short versus long term, but also the role of regulation in a common space.
Sounds super reasonable. For me, such a misconception that I held a long time was that educating with fear is a good strategy. So you would say, and that's totally nonsense. Everyone knows that. But when you look how sustainability education or environmental education often is done, you start with, here are the planetary boundaries. We have crossed already 6 of the 9 dimensions, and we have those grand challenges to face as humanity. And then you start with, maybe there are some solutions, but to focus more on the potentials, to focus more on the positive visions, to focus more on how can we really solve the problems, that would be rather my approach now. In the past, I used to start more with, let's tell people how bad, how dire the situation currently is, because I need to motivate, engage them. They really need to understand. But I quickly saw that this is not a viable strategy.
That's fascinating. Okay, so fear is not necessarily the best motivator.
So that's a confession from myself.
That's amazing. Okay, thank you for sharing.
When you think of the origins and sources of misinformation, where does misinformation, and I would count myths in and about sustainability under that category, where does it come from? How does it spread, and how does it pass the mind's immune system?
Oh, this is a really good question. If I back up just a bit, because we talked about how our beliefs are things that we accept as true. So essentially, those would be things that have passed the mind's immune system. I think one of the bigger misconceptions that I face with students is not understanding how we form our beliefs. Meaning, we have this perception of ourselves as rational creatures. All of our beliefs were the result of evaluating evidence for claims objectively, of course. And then we're really smart. And so, of course, we do this for all of our beliefs. But a lot of our beliefs just get in there through the ether. We are believing creatures. It is so much more difficult and time consuming and energy consuming to question beliefs than it is to accept them. So if we hear something and it fits with how we think the world works, so it confirms our biases. If it is something that our tribe accepts, just even the people around us, you hear it enough, so there's the reiteration effect or the illusory truth effect, then they just sort of seep in there and we don't even think to question them. And so I think a lot of these have just gone through this passive process of getting into our brains and going back afterwards and questioning them is the hard part. We have to be faced with the need to do so, and then we have to be motivated so and be willing to update based on newer information. And all that is really difficult to do.
And maybe sometimes also painful. If I held maybe a misconception for a long time and it might be part of my identity, then it can be really painful to scrutinize such a belief.
And if your social group holds a certain, it is so much easier to disagree with the other group than it is to disagree with our group. And so, coming out to our tribe and saying, you know what, I think we might be wrong about this. We risk being ostracized and losing our social connections. And so often we just don't.
So if I got you correctly, those or those social, emotional drivers are as important as the cognitive ones.
I think they are more frequently utilized by the brain, and thinking is hard work. And so, yeah, if we just hear something enough and it's just sort of in there, and so dislodging something requires the cognitive skills and motivations to be able to do so.
And to speak with Kahneman, for instance, we're more often in the system 1, in the autopilot, the heuristic-based thinking, and because it's so strenuous, less in the system 2, which would cover more the critical thinking and so on.
Yes.
What do you think? What are the consequences of a weak mental immune system in general, but also with regard to myths in and about sustainability education?
I mean, believing things that aren't true can have negative consequences. Okay, backing up, human brains have only existed in this environment for like a fraction of a second throughout all of our history. Humans, we evolved in small tribes. We knew everyone in our group. They were the source of our protection. They were how we knew friend from foe. We believed what they said. Our radius was as far as we could, our entire lives were around how far we could walk. And so they were very limited. So that these cognitive processes that we're talking about helped us survive. They didn't necessarily help us find truth,
Hmm.
and there is a difference. And so today we live in global environments. I can go online and in a fraction of a second find anyone who believes any weird belief that I have, and that confirms that I obviously was right. And so, um, but phrasing it this way, it helps us understand that the thinking that our brain is doing on mostly this auto was this sort of thinking that helped us survive.
Which is a good thing, right?
Obviously, we are the descendants of those who survived. But if we want to find truth, that is a different question. That's where, if we want to use our brain's power to find the truth, then we need to realize that sometimes we need to override the automatic processes.
Mm. What do you think are the consequences of mind bugs or mind parasites in and about sustainability education? Maybe on educators, students, but also the broader society.
Yeah, thank you. Because I forgot to bring home that point. Because then what can happen is that we can believe things that aren't true.
Mm.
And there are consequences to believing things that aren't true. It isn't necessarily immediate death, like it was for our ancestors. But it does mean potentially making bad decisions. So if our beliefs are things that we accept as true, that is what our brain uses to make decisions. What food do I buy? What medicine do I use? How do I vote? All of those things aren't immediate survival or death, but they are decisions that we're making based on what our brain thinks is true. So critical thinking is, if we shorthand it, it is a way of trying to understand something to make wiser decisions, which is wonderful, but it's not enough to know how to do that. You have to want to do it.
Mm.
Because that's the thinking part. It's hard, it's effortful, and you might have to change your mind, and all of that is really difficult to do. In my classes, I tend to focus on the what's the harm question. What is the potential harm in accepting some sort of pseudoscience or not accepting something that is true? There are reasons that our brain is drawn to those particular conclusions. There are reasons why we're denying science. There are reasons why we're accepting things that don't have good evidence. And so if we want to make better decisions, we have to be honest with ourselves. And I'm not sure I'm articulating this. Richard Feynman has a great quote that I use all the time. It is, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. That is a really difficult lesson for a lot of people because it means that our brains could be deceiving us. So if you want to make better decisions, you need to be aware of the potential harms of not aligning your beliefs with what we know about reality. So what's the harm?
I get your point. To make it concrete, if a teacher, for instance, believes sustainability education is about teaching students how to do recycling, probably a very limited conception or limited definition of sustainability education, as you mentioned before, what would be the harm or the consequences for the students, but also the broader society?
Yeah, I love your example there because I think a lot of our thinking, we give ourselves pass for good intentions. And so if my intention is to save the environment, okay, then recycling. Sure. I feel so much better putting my plastic bottle in the recycling bin than I do in the trash. It's a much harder thing to actually ask the question, is recycling accomplishing what we want it to accomplish? And so in our thinking, recognizing the difference between reasoning and rationalizing. So with reasoning, this is the part we think we're doing this, right? We think we're following evidence to a conclusion, but actually we're often rationalizing, where we start with the conclusion and then we rationalize. And the justifications for the rationalization, there's a lot of, well, I mean well, it aligns with my values, or it it makes me feel good. Oftentimes those can mask what actually might be detrimental behavior. And that's a harder thing to do, because then I have to re-ask myself, well, wait a minute. What if recycling isn't actually doing what I think it's doing? And if I want to align my decisions and behavior with my values of, I'm doing air quotes, save the environment, then I need to ask those hard questions and be willing to listen to the answers.
Yeah. In my habilitation, I'm trying to develop a myths navigator, which is kind of a web or a wiki of myths in and about sustainability educations and their refutations. So there's a little bit of connection to John Cook and his work on science denial. And my aim is to foster mental immunity or resilience against questionable beliefs about sustainability education and to foster evidence-informed sustainability education. So, with a view to your years of experience in research and practice and your various backgrounds, such as biology, chemistry, science education, cognitive immunology, which myths do you think should be included in such a wiki web of myths in and about sustainability education?
I mean, I think you probably have a better data focused answer to this question than I do. All I have is my limited experience in my classroom, so my anecdotes. For me, I think the biggest, we already covered one of them, which is that sustainability is about saving the environment. But I think another one,
It's also about saving us humans, right?
exactly, exactly. I think another one has to do with inequality. So, I teach at a community college in Massachusetts in an urban area. There's a lot of immigrant students from parts of Africa and the Caribbean, and the overall the socioeconomic level tends to be lower, which is to say that my students tend to be poor and overall more marginalized from overall American society. I think addressing the idea that when we talk about even saving the environment, I'm air quoting again here, I apologize for that. Saving the environment is a luxury belief, in that I have to be comfortable enough, have enough resources for myself and my family to be able to care about others, the environment, other species, long term. All of that means that if we want to address environmental issues, it is absolutely essential to include humans and to recognize that people don't care about those other things until they have their needs met. I travel a lot. My husband and I have been to probably over 50 countries now, and the kinds of poverty it is truly shocking what kinds of things people have to deal with. Someone who doesn't have running water or electricity, and who is like the fourth wife of an older man, and she's been genitally mutilated. Like, she doesn't care about chimpanzees, right? She doesn't care about those things. We have to help people. And I think this message tends to resonate with my students. But interestingly, by global standards, my students are wealthy. And that's a hard thing for them to understand. If you have cable TV and a hot shower and meat for dinner, then you are by global standards, doing pretty well. So it's the human component in all of this. And I think there tends to be a perception, and I might be wrong about this, but there tends to be a perception that people that care about the environment are like tree huggers who just want to save whales and don't care about people. And that is not true. Actually, focusing on those things and excluding people is counterproductive.
I would fully agree. Do you think that there are some foundation myths or foundation claims, false beliefs that myths in and sustainability education build upon? Let me give you an example. For instance, for me, such a foundation myth would be that we as humans are different from the environment. So that we can control, that we are separate, and that we dominate nature as to our liking.
Yes. Yes. Because again, like including people in this, not just to care for people, but we're a part of the environment. We depend on it. So when we're talking about, for example, addressing climate change, it's not because we're concerned for the planet. I mean, the planet is going to be fine.
It
Right.
will be fine, yeah.
The planet's been here for billions of years. It will be completely fine without humans. It's not even necessarily that we care about other species, although we should recognize that biodiversity is the machine that helps all other life on Earth thrive. We depend on biodiversity. Uh, yeah, I think you're really onto something here. When I show my students this, again, I ended up including at the very beginning of the class. It is the idea that if my students are in a city in Massachusetts and their water is coming in without them noticing and their waste is going away without them noticing and they're able to go to the grocery store and buy something without them knowing where it came from, it can all seem like they're detached from the environment. But they exist within an environment, and their footprint exists outside of their physical environment where they occupy. And so, yeah, placing them squarely within the air quotes environment is key for them understanding their place in it and how the interactions between them and the environment.
So if I got you correctly, it's about systems thinking and also to recognize that you are part of an ecosystem, that everything is connected with everything else.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an ecologist, and so this idea of being connected makes perfect sense to me, but I get that for some students it can feel very like kumbaya, and uh, I don't mean it that way. I mean it of like you are made of stardust. You have dinosaur carbon in your body. You are breathing out carbon that a plant is going to take up and use to make sugars. Like we are literally, quite literally, all connected.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you come across this in your work as a teacher. Do you sometimes have to deal with claims that are difficult to debunk or even not falsifiable in a strict sense? Like, for instance, normative claims, vague claims, future-oriented claims.
I think the biggest types of unfalsifiable claims that I run into that interfere with this kinds of education is values-based claims. Back to our beliefs. If we imagine like all of our beliefs like a web, Willard Van Orman Quine had this web of belief analogy I love. So all of our beliefs forming sort of this interconnected web in that they're all connected to each other and they all make sense. And that's partly why it's difficult to dislodge certain beliefs. Because if I'm going into like a node there in a web and saying, well, this here is a myth, pull it out and replace it with something else. If I don't recognize the role that it's playing in their overall web, then that's part of their worldview. It's a coherent whole. And our brain likes consistency, even if it's wrong. It doesn't like gaps in knowledge. But if we look at that web and drill deeper into it, at the center of it are the identity defining beliefs.
So the core beliefs.
Yes. The values tend to be things that motivate other beliefs. If my value is, I don't even know if we've come with a good example here. Values are inherently not falsifiable, but they tend to motivate other beliefs. And so if somebody, like, for example, a lot of the origin of conservatives' denial of climate change traces back to a solution aversion, not liking government intervention. Now, if I don't like government regulation, if I think government is bad, then I am motivated to deny conclusions that require a government solution. Are you familiar with Naomi Oreskes?
Yeah. So author of The Merchants of Doubt, right?
Exactly. So she traced the conservatives' denial of climate change back to smoking. So after the end of the Cold War, there was a group of scientists that were anti-communists and politicians that were anti-communist, an industry that really didn't want to be regulated. And so, for example, if a tobacco company didn't want their products to be regulated, then obviously we want to deny the problem. Smoking isn't harmful. So they implemented a campaign of disinformation to not convince the public that smoking was healthy or even that scientists were wrong, but just we didn't know enough. So if we don't know enough about the problem, why would you regulate it? Those same think tanks, scientists, were then used by fossil fuel companies to do something similar. Climate change is a global problem. Most of our environmental problems these days are global problems. Why? They're tragedies of the commons. And so they require regulation of some kind. Let me say government intervention. That could be regulation. It could be other things. But at a global level. But if I don't like that, if I want my individual rights to do whatever I want, then I'm going to deny that problem. The value part, those core beliefs, those are the kinds of things that tend to motivate the thinking and to potentially accepting myths. So for me, the unfalsifiable part is the values. Now, how I would counter that would be so what's the harm? So if you don't like government regulation, okay, so let's say that we do nothing.
So laissez-faire. Anything goes.
Anything goes. On something like, let's do climate change, for example. Okay, how long are we going to do this before it gets so out of control that even more draconian measures are required to address the problem? And actually, Oreskes wrote a really fascinating book. It's a cli-fi book. It's set in the future so it's a Chinese scientist who's telling the story. Oh, the collapse of Western civilization.
Oh, sounds cool. Well, not the title, but actually interesting.
So what she's done is set this dystopian like future, a novel in the future where we did nothing to address climate change, and it got so bad that we needed to do even more and more extreme things. Now, Eastern civilizations, because they were authoritarian, were able to say, you know what, you are not going to build here. You're going to build here, and you're going to here's what you're going to do. And so Eastern civilization, communist civilization, survived. In the West, people were so fighting over in democracy. Well, what do we actually this? And is there even a problem? And so Western civilization collapsed, which is why the future is being told by a communist scientist. All that's to say, okay, so if you deny the problem, you then take yourself out of being able to be a part of the solution. If you want to have a say in what the solution, let's say that you don't like regulation, what will you accept to address this problem? All of that requires accepting the problem.
Yeah, makes super sense. It's also about long-term thinking again, and to balance different values. What I saw from your resources online, you sometimes tend to use the Goldilocks zone or the Goldilocks principle. I find your approaches to dealing with misinformation quite refreshing. Instead of just debunking misinformation with refutations, texts, You also use sometimes infographics, cartoons, videos, etc. And I really love your materials on thinking as power. Why do you use so many different formats? What is your motivation for doing that? It's probably quite a lot of work to provide these different sources.
Well, first, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that. Thank you for noticing. I've been teaching environmental science for a long time and kind of got frustrated because I felt like I was just giving my students a bunch of bad news. And I and I also I wanted to help them. There was a root of the problem that I wasn't getting to, which is why I started to do thinking is power, based on the premise that knowledge is power, but there's too much to know. So instead, thinking is power. And so I started it primarily for them, but then I kind of thought, well, I wonder if like just people who aren't my students might be interested in this. And also, there are a lot of really great critical thinking resources out there. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot at the introductory level, and my students have taught me a lot over the years in terms of what they know. I call my audience the normals. They're the sort of average person. Like people on one end of the extreme, they don't really need me, and people on the other ends are really difficult to reach. So I focus in the middle. What do they know? What do they need to know? What's the best way to phrase a message so that they might hear it? And what I realize is that, like, again, thinking is hard work. And so if we want people to do it, it doesn't have to be stuffy. We can use fun colors and silly fonts and cartoons and jokes. And so that's why I started to do that. And also, I try to approach these issues in a way that's not triggering, meaning climate change is obviously a really important issue. And there's a lot of bad information out there, disinformation about climate change. But there's also certain types of people, because of their identities and core beliefs, that do not accept climate change. If I want them to understand, to be open to accepting it, like if I go in with climate change, if I start with evolution or vaccines or whatever it is, then I'm going to trigger certain people. They're going to get defensive. I wanted people to not be triggered, to be open to a message. Humor and starting with non-triggering examples, I have found, are a great way to do it.
Mm. So you're moving a little bit away from the content and you're more focusing or addressing the techniques or the mechanisms behind it. So sometimes people are fed up with the sustainability topic because it's everywhere on the media. They're fed up sometimes with vaccination and so on. And going a step back and focusing more on the processes, on the fallacies, for instance, this makes it more accessible, more approachable for your audience. Did I get that correctly?
That's exactly what I'm trying to do.
What really fascinates me about your approach is like active inoculation that you seem to use and experiential inoculation. Could you elaborate a little bit on these misconception-based teaching approaches and also why you are using those?
Oh, God, I love inoculation exercises. So back to mental immunity. Inoculation theory dates back to William McGuire from, I think it was the 50s. And the idea is that it's like a vaccine analogy. If you expose the body to a bit of a pathogen, then the body can build up an immunity to that pathogen so that when it is exposed to it in real life, it's able to fight it off. You can do something similar, but with misinformation. So expose the mind to a bit of misinformation, along with techniques to resist the persuasion. And the mind can build antibodies. They can build resistance to that misinformation. So there are different types of inoculation. Most of what I do is active technique-based inoculation. So what that means is technique-based is here are the techniques of a type of misinformation. So science denial, for example, is largely uses the technique summarized by Flick. So John Cook has popularized these. It's fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. Okay. So those are the techniques of science denial. So I would teach my students those techniques. And then active means they create misinformation. So they would use the flick techniques to create misinformation. I'm finishing a lesson plan right now, actually, around Cranky Uncle, which is again John Cook. Cranky Uncle is a wonderful game. It teaches the techniques of flick. Cranky Uncle is a science denier, and you spot what he's doing, and you recognize those techniques, and you earn cranky points and unlock new levels. It's really great. So it is active inoculation, but I take it a step further and then say, okay, now you are cranky uncle. So to the students, you get to be cranky uncle. Pick an issue to deny. So like air isn't real or gravity is a hoax. I mean, something really stupid. And again, the sillier the better. Don't pick, evolution isn't real or something that would actually trigger people. And actually, that's the opposite of science now because evolution is true. Never mind. But what they do there is they use the flick techniques then to, well, here's the scientist that says that gravity isn't real. And look, that bird is flying. Gravity can't be real. Or just to make it stupid. But by using the techniques of this particular type of misinformation, science now, and creating their own arguments, then in real life, they're better able to spot those arguments. Now, if I had students do climate change denial, then those students who come from backgrounds where they don't accept climate change would just be turned off by the entire assignment. But by denying gravity or cats, then they're able to, I use cats for everything. Then they're able to build those antibodies in a way that hopefully helps them start to see them right and question their own beliefs.
So then they would be able to spot a false dilemma, not just with regard to cats, but also with regard to sustainability education or another topic.
That would be the goal. I mean, you have to build those antibodies first, and then you have to build up immunity over time. I call these critical thinking training wheels in my class. So idea is that you start with non-triggering concepts, teach students the skills, teach them how misinformation works, teach them about their own thinking and their own vulnerabilities to misinformation, but start with silly stuff and then let them progress to, we'll get to mountain biking, but we got to start with training wheels. If I started with mountain biking, then some students would just fall and they would never get back on the bike again.
I see. I've come across experiential inoculation in your resources. I haven't heard or seen it before, and I found it quite intriguing. Could you briefly elaborate on that? Why you use it, what it is about?
That actually, so John was out to stay with me for a conference at Harvard, and he got COVID and couldn't go, and so he spent quarantine at my apartment.
Woo him.
I know. Actually, because he was coming from all the way from Australia, so I felt really bad for the guy. So he was stuck with COVID in our apartment, and I asked him this question. I'm like, "So, John, I do this assignment with my students. I start class literally day one, and I tell my students, okay, so I have a friend who's an astrologer, and she does personality readings, and she's offered to do free personality readings for everybody in this class. I just need this basic information from you. And long story short, I fool them. I give them personality readings. They think they're awesome, but they all get the same reading. And so I fool them to show them how easily they can be fooled. It's actually a really important lesson in intellectual humility. If I want students to recognize, if I want them to think critically, then they need to realize they can be fooled. I mean, most of us think that other people are stupid, right? They can be fooled, but not me. I'm too smart. Like, no, actually, hold my beer. I'm going to show you can be fooled. And so I was talking with John about this while he was in quarantine, and I'm like, what kind of inoculation is that? He's like, oh, I actually don't know. So we coined the term experiential inoculation based on that assignment. But the idea is students are inoculated against a type of misinformation by experiencing being misled by that kind of information.
And there we are back again with Feynman, right?
Exactly.
From your experience, what strategies have been most effective in identifying, analyzing, and dispelling questionable beliefs? Various domains, but also with regard to sustainability in higher education. Maybe, but that are not that known. So a lot of people would, for instance, use debunking or would maybe also use inoculation, but are there strategies that are highly effective, but not that are publicly or known in the fields of education, psychology, etc.?
I would just strongly advocate for inoculation. I don't think it's as well known in education as it should be, not only because it's effective, but also because it can be really fun. It's a really entertaining and engaging and effective way to inoculate against various myths and false beliefs. That's why, by the way, as education director of the Mental Immunity Project, I've been trying to create lesson plans that address some of these broad types of misinformation. So, like, I've got one on logical fallacies. There's one on pseudoscience, science denial. I'm working on one on tribalism and propaganda, and so I I I think for a long time in just science education in general, we've done a lot of lab-based activities where students follow some sort of script or like there's a right answer, I should say, experiment that you do, but here's what you're supposed to get. There's value in doing some of those, obviously, because we want students to understand the process of science. But those don't address misinformation, and they don't help students see how that misinformation works, why it fools them,
Mm.
and to be able to spot it in real life.
Yeah. I find that super valuable. Also from that standpoint that prevention sometimes is better than intervention. And with pre-bunking, you already have some antibodies, right? And don't have to intervene when the child has already fallen into the well. Can you say that in English?
Yes, I understand what you mean.
I would like to do a quick round on statements before we end our conversation. And I would like you to indicate briefly whether you see the following statements as myths, facts, or something in between. And maybe provide, if you want to, a brief explanation of your reasoning. And statement one would be claim XYZ about sustainability education is a matter of beliefs, or in other words, I'm entitled to my opinion.
You just want to trigger me, don't you? Because I'm entitled to my opinion. Oh my goodness. I actually, I have a write-up about that on my website, because I'm entitled to my look, in a democracy, it is absolutely true. You are entitled to believe whatever you wanna believe. But when somebody says that, what they're usually doing is shielding a belief from scrutiny.
Mm. So is it rather a myth, a fact, or something in between?
I think it is a justification we give ourselves to accept something that we don't wanna question. So, I don't know if it would be a myth. It would be I mean, it is something that is absolutely real. It is a key part, though, of motivated reasoning. And if we don't wanna fool ourselves, we need to recognize that what we're doing there is we just don't wanna be wrong.
Statement two would be claim XYZ about sustainability education. Well, it doesn't help, but it doesn't hurt either.
Are you familiar with the phrase "thought terminating cliché"?
Nope.
Yeah, because that's what these are. It's thought terminating cliché. I wish I could credit whoever came up with this, but it's basically by saying this, I can just stop the conversation because it sounds profound, but it's actually pseudo. What it really does is prevents any further discussion. So it doesn't help, but it doesn't hurt either. I mean, what does that mean? It sounds like what it means is I don't really want to think about this much further.
I see. And then it delays action, for instance, and you don't get to a decision or don't pursue a certain direction or something like that.
Yeah.
Statement three. Isn't there also a good aspect or a good idea in claim XYZ about sustainability education?
I'm not sure I've ever heard that one.
So if someone says, here is maybe a misleading idea, maybe a myth, and he says, but isn't there also a good thing in it, like a kernel of truth or
Yeah, that sounds like another thought terminating cliche. A way to justify to ourselves that we just don't want to think about this any further. And we don't want to change our minds. Okay.
Statement 4 would be educators should ignore sustainability education-related misinformation and focus on the facts instead.
I know that one's interesting. Because to me, what that gets at is the difference between understanding reality and then what we do with reality. And I actually think those are good distinctions to make. I think a lot of people conflate the two, which is why if somebody wants to avoid regulation, will deny the problem. They're not distinguishing between an understanding of between the process of science and the knowledge it gives and then the decisions that we make on those. So I do think there's value in separating the two of those, but I also like because you just like are triggering me with these things with this facts thing. Because what I've learned is, I think a lot of people have this mistaken impression that science provide facts. Like it proves things to be true. The textbook is full of things that are proven to be true, and when that textbook includes whatever it is that you're talking about, then I'll accept it. Without distinguishing between the different kinds of knowledge that science provides. I mean, some of it are facts, but facts can change. There's also theories and laws and consensuses and models and all kinds of other things. And so, to me, that seems like a cop out from even so not clearly distinguishing between knowledge and what we do with the knowledge, but also what is knowledge itself.
Mm. Sorry for triggering you. Those claims or statements are triggering me, and I want to. And when I hear them from students or colleagues, and I would really love to, well, in the situation, then be able to have a good argument or maybe to look behind the claim and see what the value behind is so that I can better deal with those. For instance, I come across this educators should ignore misinformation because it's too deficit oriented. You should rather focus right away on the facts and be more resource oriented. So that working with the misinformation or with the myths is kind of a digression or a detour. What I found and I believe at the moment is that it's even more valuable to work with the misconceptions because I think it can foster deeper learning, more sustainable learning. So I find it very valuable to really address potential misconceptions that students might have. Also to show them the difference between the misconception and the more differentiated version or more differentiated beliefs.
That's fascinating. I in the United States, at least, in science, misinformation is not even mentioned in the standards. And it's really frustrating because there are a lot of misconceptions and myths around scientific findings. And so I'm a big proponent of including misinformation for those very reasons. Like, first, it's one of the best ways to show students the difference between reliable information and unreliable information. In class, if all we're doing is helping students, giving students good information, and they walk out of the class and open their phone, how are they to know the difference? Exactly.
Mhm. Statement 5, last statement. When it comes to sustainability education, if people understood, they would change.
I just don't think that's true. My father smoked his whole life. Um, and it ultimately killed him.
Sorry for that.
My point is, he knew it was bad for him. Did it cause him to quit? Right. That's what happens. Sometimes our motivations to do things override what we know to be best. And we also know that giving people more information, so this is called the information deficit model. In education for a long time, science education in particular, we've labored under the assumption that they just the students don't accept evolution because they don't have all the information. And if I give them all of the information, then they will
The
understand.
facts.
Yes. Their denial of those issues is not related to an information deficit. It's related to those underlying motivations, those core beliefs, those values, those desires, sometimes a difficulty in accepting a solution. If we don't address those, then we can't address beliefs and behaviors.
I would agree, but at the same time, I ask myself, then is my work that I'm doing, or maybe also your work, a little bit futile or a battle against windmills? Because we try to think through problems, we try to debunk, to pre-bunk, which is rather cognitive work. But nevertheless, I think it's important, and we shouldn't stop fighting this battle.
I'm glad you brought that up, and push back on that a bit, because our goal is to address something like, in this case, climate change. But if we want people to understand, to come together around solutions, understanding the problem is important, but making the solutions palatable and not in conflict with people's identities or values. So, for example, with climate change, various solutions have been proposed around taxing carbon or with cap and trade programs. There are various solutions that we can put in place. I think what a lot of people hear is, I'm going to have to give up meat and drive an electric vehicle. And those might be part of a solution. Putting people into a system in which they can make choices, but that might be incentivized by incentivized by the decisions that benefit overall society and reduce the problem might be a better way of just saying, if you understood, because what I heard is, if you understand that climate change is a problem, then you're going to drive an electric vehicle and not eat meat. It is complicated. And so understanding how people fit into that system and understanding the problem is great, but somebody might not even accept climate change, and hopefully they could still make solutions that would be goal-oriented.
So it's also a little bit about nudging, but at the same time leaving people autonomy and not being too instrumental.
I'm from Iowa. When I go back home to Iowa, the state is absolutely full of windmills. A lot of farmers have put windmills on their properties. It is not because most of them are like, oh yeah, climate change is this big problem and I want to be part of a solution. It's because they've been financially incentivized to put up windmills. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. When we come to the end of our interview, what do you think are the most pressing questions that future research on myths in and about sustainability education, so my field, should address?
I mean, I like to drill down to the core as much as possible.
Yep.
If we want to solve a problem, we have to understand what's behind it. And so, what could we best do to understand why people believe what they believe and why they act the way that they act, so that we can align those with the solutions, that we know will benefit the problem. Does that make sense?
If I got you correctly, and also looking back to our conversation, you mentioned solution aversion. You also mentioned like the values that lie behind certain beliefs that drive our reasoning, that drive our actions, and to tackle those explicitly. Does this make sense?
This is why I shifted from teaching environmental science and a sustainable landscaping program to teaching explicitly critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy. To me, it gets to the root of how we form our beliefs and the decisions that we make, and hopefully does so in a way that allows people, that isn't just domain specific, right? So we're talking about climate change now, but we could be talking about the water sources or species extinctions or any number of things. So giving them those tools so that they feel empowered to think more clearly and make better decisions, and also not fall for misinformation or disinformation, meaning not let others manipulate them.
I think that's a very important point that you mentioned here. For me, it's also crucial that for me, it's not about telling people what to think. It's about leaving them it's about intellectual freedom, intellectual independence. That's what I meant. That's very important in all my work, and I'm not sure, probably in yours as well.
Yeah, I mean, people don't like to feel there's also a reactance bias, which is speaking of comics, like, my favorite comic for that one is there's a sign that says, "No juggling machetes," and somebody says, "All of a sudden, I wanna juggle machetes."
Nice.
We don't like to be told what to do, and so helping people think through these things themselves, which to me, as a science educator, I look back, maybe this was the myths that I fell for, was things like we've come full circle, things like the information deficit, or my thought was if I just give students the science of climate change, then they'll accept it. The thing is, climate change science is really challenging. It's complicated. It's huge and nuanced from all different kinds of fields. And so nobody has time for that unless you're a climate scientist. So the better thing for me is, okay, here's what I believe. Why do I believe this?
Mhm.
What is the best source of information here? That would be finding a consensus. Why is it that they have come to this conclusion? Okay, now what are the best possible solutions? And all of that requires us knowing ourselves and being able to, this is what I think is independent or critical thinking. For myself, being able to find reliable sources of information, know myself well enough so that I don't fall for things, so that I can make better decisions.
Yeah, that's so nice. Could you recommend any literature, resources, or persons that may be interesting to explore?
I get asked this question a lot, so I'm not shameless plugging here, but on my website there's a resources tab, and I have put my favorite books and courses and podcasts and games and even kid stuff that I think are useful to the normals. I would strongly recommend Cranky Uncle. It is on there, so if you have not played Cranky Uncle, people out there, please play Cranky Uncle.
I
Which
played Cranky Uncle myself. I can highly recommend it. It's so cool.
Isn't it awesome? So whenever my students play it, they're like, "Oh, I know this guy. I just saw him at Thanksgiving." We all have a cranky uncle. The other thing I would say is Sander van der Linden has some really nice resources.
Also on inoculation, and with his book Foolproof, right?
Yeah. He has a game, Bad News. Bad News is basically, it's a propaganda game where you get to be a fake news purveyor. Yeah, there are really fun ways to do this.
I see. I already played that game as well.
Oh, and did you win?
Um, Before we conclude, is there anything else you would like to add or emphasize regarding the topic we've talked about, myths in and about sustainability education?
I don't think so. I think that I think I've said what I wanted to say, and also you probably got some things out of me that I wasn't expecting to say. So you should definitely look up thought terminating cliches, because I think you might appreciate that if you're actually hearing those kinds of.
Yeah, and that's a very cool tip. Thank you very much for your insights. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. Time flew by, and thanks a lot for taking the time. I really appreciate that.
Thank you for everything that you're doing as well. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your interest in the Sustainability Education podcast. Did you find the insights helpful? Do you have any questions, comments, or objections? Then feel free to get in touch and share this episode with others. This podcast is produced by the Institute of Business Education and Educational Management at the University of St. Gallen. Thank you for listening, and hear you in the next episode. Bye bye.